Good evening. My name is Andrea, one of BergamoScienza volunteers. Before starting, kindly ask you to remember that connecting to BergamoScienza.it site and clicking on the live button, you can post on Facebook the live event, send questions to speakers, or invite one's friends and followers to follow the event online. Questions from the web will be selected by the volunteers, and then they will be posed during the question and answer session. Questions can also be written on the live chat on the YouTube live event. For simultaneous translation, scan the QR code that you can find on the doors of this room or projected behind me. The QR code will directly address you to Converso web app, where you can select the translation language from the scroll down menu. To listen to the translation, you need a pair of earphones. We kindly ask you to use your own. Should you be deprived of them, you can ask the volunteers in the room. Please mute your mobile phones and attend BergamoScienza initiatives. You are invited to follow us on the Instagram profile, where we tell the story of the festival on a daily basis. Thank you very much and enjoy the evening. Good evening to you all. Useless to say that it is a great pleasure to be back in person at this event. We are very excited by the opportunities offered to us all by IT, but we also realize that some things cannot be easily replaced. For BergamoScienza veterans, I believe that tonight's conference could be considered a continuation of a sort of red thread, though not favoring any discipline, trying to face and to tackle science 360 decisions. There are subjects that deviate from science sometimes, and this is the decision-making process. We had very many scientists that we invited that covered the scientific part of this decision-making process. Ray Dolan, very many guests that spoke about neurobiological correlates and decision-making processes from the scientific perspective. But we also have the behavioral aspect to be considered. A beautiful paper was published recently. Behavioral sciences are key for neurosciences because we might try to understand how the brain works, but unless you have very good models, behavioral models, trying to understand what's taking place when people take decisions in real life, no good science can be performed. And this aspect also has practical implications because the decision-making process is the job of many individuals, such as managers at all levels, politicians, and they keep taking decisions on a daily basis. It's part of their role. In the past, we had the speakers who spoke about biases which are inherent in the human condition and which are expressed even in decisions whose impact can be very negative, and this is true for many different fields. Many studies focused on economics, but I believe that many of us today are both worried for economic reasons, but also for political reasons. And tonight, here with us, we have a guest we would like to welcome, and we are pleased to welcome. He wrote a couple of books, and they have been translated into Italian. He wrote many books, but just two were translated into Italian. The first one that was recently published has an outstanding title. What is the title in English? You are about to make a terrible mistake. This is the title in English. And this book deals with different aspects. There isn't just the decisional bias, but there are also other aspects connected to the fact that human beings, human brains, are imperfect decision makers. The second book, which will be shortly published in Italian, is a book that was written by a dream team of experts, Daniel Kahneman. I believe it is very familiar to many of you. He was Nobel laureate for economics. Olivier Sibony, who is here with us tonight, and also another member of the dream team is Cass, I can't remember the name, Cass Sunstein. And he too is a name who is familiar to many of you because he wrote another bestseller on the decision-making process that keeps having a great impact. The title was Nudge. I would say that I don't need to steal any more time. I leave the floor to Olivier Sibony, who will be dealing with all these aspects that concern another aspect of decision-making process, which is the undesirable variability due to personal differences, which is very important both theoretically but also practically for our daily lives. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Buonasera. This is basically the extent of my Italian, so I apologize that I'm going to be speaking English. Indeed, we're going to be talking about these two things that Stefano so kindly introduced. One which is bias, which is probably fairly familiar to you, and the other which is noise, which is another phenomenon that is probably less familiar to you. And since we're talking about human judgment, and you're all humans, and you all have judgment, I'm going to ask you to participate. We're going to do a couple of experiments. After all, we're scientists here, so let's experiment. Let's do an experiment using your phones. Can you please grab your phones and scan the QR code here? And this should take you to a page that looks like this, but don't answer the question just yet. I'm going to tell you what the question is in a second. So please log in. You're going to see a question. I'm going to explain the question in a second. I'm just giving you time to scan the code. I will show it again in a second, but let me now explain the question. The question is this. Suppose you go to a big insurance company, a very successful and respectable insurance company, and you ask two different people in the insurance company to make the same professional judgment. So for instance, you go to the underwriting department, and you may or may not know, but the underwriters are the people who set the price of insurance policies. So suppose you want to insure a big factory against the risk of fire, you would go there and an underwriter would say, yeah, that's going to cost you 50,000 euros a year. Now, suppose that you ask not just that underwriter, but another underwriter in the same company. Another underwriter who uses the same methods, who has the same training as an actuary, who has the same experience, who basically is supposed to make the same judgment for the same customer on behalf of the company. My question to you is, how much of a difference would you expect between the numbers that these two experts are going to give you? Two experts who are supposed to be making the same judgments based on the same facts in the same company. How much of a difference in percentage are you going to find? I'm hiding the answers, but you can now answer. We've got, as you can see, 37 answers. I'm going to wait until we have a few more. I'm going to show again the code for those of you who may not have been able to connect. Okay, we've got quite a lot of answers. I will show you your answers in a second. But first, I'm going to ask you a second question, which is more difficult. Now that you're warmed up, we can have a more difficult judgment. We're going to assume that you are all the board members of a financial company that needs to hire its next chief executive officer. You need to hire the chief executive officer of a financial firm, a regional financial firm, a regional bank, say. And you're going to read the profile of a candidate called Michael Gambardi. I'm going to leave you 1 minute to read a text that describes everything we know about Michael Gambardi. After 60 seconds, I will ask you to give me an estimate of the probability that Michael Gambardi will be successful in that job if he is hired. And by successful, I just mean that if hired, he will still be around in 2 years' time. Right? So if Michael is hired in the job, what is the probability that he will still be in the job in 2 years? That's what we know about him. I'll give you 60 seconds to read it. And after 60 seconds, I will ask you to tell me how likely he is to succeed. Twenty seconds. Okay, I assume you've all read. So now you can answer. If you think Michael has no chance of being successful, you will answer between 0 and 10. If you think he is certain to be successful, you will answer 90 to 100. Anything in between, of course, is your estimate of the probability that he will be successful. What are the odds that Michael will be successful in that job? We've got 75 answers. Okay, you can keep answering. Now, let me show you the answer to the first question. On the first question, you thought that the most likely difference between two estimates was probably less than 10%. Roughly half of you say less than 10%, and a little less than half say more than 10%. In that, you are actually very typical, because this is the sort of answer we get from finance professionals. And typically, when we ask this in the insurance company, they tell us that 10% is the number they expect. Basically, they say, yeah, our underwriters are not machines. They are experts. They have to make a judgment. We don't expect them to agree exactly, but of course, we don't expect them to be in complete disagreement either, so a 10% difference feels fine, and that's what you collectively said would be the difference. But what happens when we actually do that experiment? When we actually give the same application to two different underwriters, what we find is a difference of 55%. So two people who are given exactly the same facts and who are supposed to be experts at what they're doing give you completely different answers, much more different than we all expect, much more different than the executives of the insurance company would think is tolerable. What about the next question, the Gambardi question? Let's see what you collectively answered. You answered all over the place. Some of you say 0, some say 100, and basically everything in between is represented. That, again, is very typical. That's where we find everywhere with HR executives, with finance executives. Basically, you all read exactly the same information. None of you has actually met Michael Gambardi. By the way, he doesn't exist. But all of you had exactly the same information, and despite having exactly the same information, you draw completely different conclusions from that information, diametrically opposed conclusions. This phenomenon is what we call noise. It's the variability of judgments that ideally should be identical. If we are competent people making a professional judgment, as the underwriters are, as by hypothesis we are here when we're making judgment about professionals, we should be not in perfect agreement, but reasonably close. And in fact, what we find here is a variability which we're going to call noise. Now, why do we call it noise, and what is the difference with something you already know called bias, which is also, of course, present in our judgments? Let's take a few examples of bias. We know, that's a very well-known bias, that we tend to be overconfident. We overestimate ourselves. If I asked you here how well you drive relative to the population, about 90% of you would think that you belong to the better 50% of the population. That's a known fact. That's a bias. It's a predictable mistake. Another example, which is partly a consequence of overconfidence, is called the planning fallacy. If you're planning to build an opera house, or if you're simply planning to have your kitchen redecorated, it's going to take longer than you think. It usually takes longer than we think, even though we've been warned a lot of times against the fact that it's going to take longer than we think. Yet another example you've heard about is groupthink. When a lot of people around us think something, we tend to think like them. Another example of bias, time inconsistent preferences. We all want to grasp the bowl of peanuts, even though we know that tomorrow when we get on the bathroom scale, we will regret that. Or a final example, inertia. If we have a choice to make, the choice we are most likely to make is no choice at all. So if I tell you that if you don't do anything, you will be enrolled in a savings program, you will enroll. If I tell you that if you don't do anything, you will not be enrolled in a savings program, you will not be enrolled. And depending on what default setting we choose, we can actually nudge you. Stefano was talking about nudges. We can nudge you in a particular direction. All these, and there are many more, are examples of biases, by which we mean predictable behaviors. The definition of bias is that it's something we understand, it's something we can explain, and therefore it's something we can predict. To take an analogy, suppose that we go to a shooting range. Of course, if we were all perfect and we were all using the same gun, we would all hit the bullseye, as with this team here. If we have a bias, the target is going to look like this. It's going to look like everybody shooting in the same place, but it's the wrong place. We're making a predictable shared mistake. That's a bias. If someone else is going to use the same gun to shoot at the same target, you can all guess where that shot is going to land, in the same place as the first 5. And if I ask you why this is happening, you probably have a lot of ideas coming to mind already. Something is wrong with the gun, or maybe the wind is blowing. Something explains this mistake, and it's a predictable mistake. That's a bias. But what we've seen with the little games I had you play is not that. It's not clear that we're all making a mistake, but it's clear that we're all in disagreement. So it looks more like this. This is what we have when we have noise. We have answers that are all over the place, that are unpredictable, and that pose a problem because they are variable. Of course, by the way, we could have both noise and bias. And that's what we have in most human judgments. In most human judgments, we are both on average wrong, and that's the bias, and also variable around that average, dispersed around the target, that's the noise. So in all human judgments, we're going to find the combination of bias and noise. Let's look at a few examples, some of them striking. When you take criminal judges in the US and you give them criminal cases and you ask them how many years should this person spend in prison. Now, I'm not talking about comparing similar cases at different times in different places with different judges. I'm talking about an experiment in which you give the exact same description of a case. the crime that has been committed, the background of the defendant, the specifics of the victim, the specifics of the case. The same crime is described in great detail in exactly the same way for all the judges. And we give this to 200 judges. On average, for a sentence that is on average 7 years, the difference between two judges is roughly 4 years. That's the difference between 5 years and 9 years. But that's only the average. For each of the crimes, you have judges who say 1 year in prison and judges who say life in prison. There is nothing that changes from 1 year in prison to life in prison except the identity of the judge. That is noise in the judicial system. Here's another example. We have quite a few doctors here, and they know that diagnoses can be quite variable. They are variable in fields where we expect them to be highly variable, like psychiatry. They're also variable in fields where we would expect them to be less variable, like diagnosing an artery blockage on an angiogram or looking at an X-ray or a mammogram. We see quite a high percentage of disagreement on those judgments. Now, that's not to say that there is anything wrong with the people making those judgments. They are all experts, just like the judges in the previous example are all experts, just like the people making assessments on behalf of the insurance company are all experts. These judgments are difficult. The reason we are noisy in our judgments is because judgment is hard. The harder the judgment, the noisier it is. But we tend to grossly underestimate how noisy those judgments can be. Why are our judgments noisy? There's really 3 different answers, and you're going to see that the first 2 are fairly intuitive, the third one a bit less so. The first answer is what we call level noise. Basically, some people have a higher or lower level of judgments than others. Let me give you an example. In a courthouse that looks at asylum seekers in the US, this one is in Miami, there are several judges. And basically, the asylum seekers are assigned to these 2 judges randomly. They have the same background, and depending on which judge is available, they go to Judge 1 or to Judge 2. Judge 1 admits 88% of the asylum seekers. Judge 2 admits 5%. So depending on the lottery that assigns you to Judge 1 or to Judge 2, your chances of being granted asylum in the US are multiplied or divided by 14. Clearly, this is because one of these judges has a different bias from the other. One of these judges is probably a card-carrying Republican who believes that asylum should be strictly restricted, and the other is probably a card-carrying Democrat who believes that the US should welcome a lot of asylum seekers. They have different biases, but from the perspective of the asylum seeker or of the citizen who has appointed these judges to do their job, the result of the variability in their individual levels is actually a lot of noise. Essentially, this turns the system into a lottery. So that's the first type of noise, level noise. Second, we have something that's perhaps even more troubling called occasion noise, which is that when the same person makes the same judgment a second time, they're actually not going to make the same judgment. Here's an example. Fingerprint examiners. When you show the same pair of fingerprints to 2 experts in the FBI or in some other places where they are experts at reading fingerprints, they have to say, yes, this is a match. The suspect fingerprints match the ones that have been taken at the crime scene, or no, it's not a match. Quite often, they actually disagree. This is not a perfect science. But most strikingly, in about 10% of cases, if you show them again a pair of fingerprints that they have seen a few months ago, which of course they do not remember because fingerprints are not very memorable, they will give you a different answer. In 10% of the cases, they will disagree with themselves. There is noise from one occasion to the next within the same person making the same judgments based on the same facts. We like to think that our judgments are stable, but in fact, they're a bit shaky. They are variable, just like if you try to throw a piece of paper into the wastebasket, you won't succeed every time. Here are a few examples of that. Judges are influenced by factors that are purely occasional and that have nothing to do with the case. We have quantitative evidence showing that they are more severe before lunch than after lunch. We have evidence that they are more severe on the days when their favorite football team lost the game than on the days when it won the game. We have studies showing that after several favorable decisions, a judge will revert to being severe. And conversely, after several unfavorable decisions, they will tend to be more lenient. And we even have evidence that judgments are more severe on hot days than on cool days, even when they are rendered in an air-conditioned room, because apparently the judges are in a bad mood when they get to the courthouse. So judges are sensitive to occasion noise. So are doctors, by the way. Doctors will give you very different prescriptions at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day. They are more likely to prescribe preventive care, like vaccines, like cancer screening in the morning than in the afternoon. They are, on the other hand, more likely to prescribe opioids in the afternoon than in the morning. Tip, make your doctor's appointment in the morning. They're just better. So that's occasion noise. We vary between people, level noise. We vary within people, occasion noise. But then we have a third type of noise, which I'm going to call pattern noise. And that's basically the fact that in judgments, as in other things, we have different tastes. We have different preferences. We're sensitive to different things. We respond to different stimuli. For instance, when I asked you this question, why do you all have different views about Michael Gambardi? Because when you read that text, you paid attention to different things. Some of you latched on the green words, the positive words, the ones that suggest that Michael is a good guy. Yeah, he's a bit of a jerk, but hey, he gets things done. Why did you catch those words? Maybe because you're more impressed by words like Harvard Business School, or maybe because you met someone in your life who was a bit like Michael and who was actually successful. Others were captured by the red words. Maybe because you have had a boss like that who is actually a jerk, and you hate him, and you immediately recognized Michael or you recognized that boss when you saw the profile of Michael. So even though we look at the same text, or at the same facts, or at the same patient if we're a doctor, or at the same defendant if we're a judge, we're actually not looking with the same eyes. We're looking through the lens of our history, of our experience, of our prejudices, of our values, of our beliefs. Basically, we're all different. And because we're all different, we can't expect our judgments to be anything but all different. Our judgments are different because we are. Now, when I say that, you're probably thinking, yeah, we're all different, and that's a good thing, right? It's a good thing that we're all different. Sorry. We wouldn't want to all be clones. And of course we wouldn't want to. But here's the thing. This is not good news. That we're all different is certainly good news. Again, I don't want everybody to be clones. But this is not good diversity. This is a mess. This is noise. Wherever accuracy matters, noise is bad news. Noise is not positive diversity. Let's look at the difference. Sometimes, we want diversity. Diversity is good. Variation is good. If we are talking about tastes, diversity is very good. If we are trying to be innovative, if we're trying to come up with new ideas, of course we want very diverse ideas. If we are in competition with one another, of course diversity is good because some of us are going to win and others are going to lose. Remember the basic Darwin principle. Variation, then selection. Without variation, we can't have selection. Without selection, we can't have evolution. So if you're going to have some sort of selection, because you're innovating and we're going to see what works, or because you're in a market and we're going to see who wins. Variation is great. But if you go to one doctor and he says, I'm afraid this is cancer, and then you go to another doctor and he says, no, this is a benign tumor, you don't say, oh, wonderful, that's diversity. You say that's a problem, because there is a correct answer here. And wherever we believe there is a correct answer, diversity can only mean one thing, that someone is wrong. So noise, as we define it here, is not the fact that we disagree when we should disagree, and there are situations when we should disagree. It's the fact that in what we call professional judgments, where we believe there is a best possible answer, any disagreement that is greater than the limited amount of disagreement we are prepared to tolerate is actually very bad news. When you said the insurance experts should not disagree by more than 10%, what you were saying is, if they disagree by 55%, that makes a mockery of the insurance company. And in fact, it does, because they do disagree by 55%. Contrary to what people sometimes think, the fact that noise is a random error does not mean it cancels out. If, on average, doctors are diagnosing the correct percentage of people with a disease, that does not mean that they are diagnosing the right people. So you don't want, on average, your judgments to be correct. You want every judgment to be correct, and that's what noise kills. Basically, if you want to make a long story short, bias and noise are the two components of error. And this is very simple basic statistics. In fact, error is bias plus noise, or more accurately, error measured as mean squared error, for those with a background in statistics, is the sum of the squares of bias and noise, which basically means that if you increase noise by a unit of 1, you will add as much to error as if you increase bias by a unit of 1. Or to say it differently, this tells you that we should be just as concerned about noise as we are concerned about bias. But we've all heard about biases. We've all talked about biases. We can all mention biases that we're trying to combat. And of course, that's right. We simply don't pay enough attention to noise. We're not aware of it because we have this wrong idea that if, on average, it cancels out, then it's not a big deal. As these examples, I hope, show, it is actually a big deal. Sometimes, and I want to cover all main objections here, and I hope we'll have lots of other questions and objections, but sometimes people say, well, but hold on. What if there is no single best answer, right? When we say the doctor 1 says A and doctor 2 says B, there is a truth there, so one of them must be wrong. But the judges, how can you say one of them is wrong? And that's the thing. I'm not saying one of them is wrong. I don't know which one of them is wrong. All I'm saying is that if many different judges have many different judgments, if basically the game of justice is a game of roulette, we have a problem with the system. I don't need to know which of the judges is right to believe that if one of them says 1 year in prison and another one says life in prison for the same crime, we have a problem with the judicial system. So that's the problem of noise. It's a problem of fairness. Similarly, people should be treated similarly. Justice should not be a lottery. Yes, yet it is. It's a problem of credibility. If you go to your insurance company and you are treated very differently from someone else who is asking for exactly the same thing, that does not reflect very well on the insurance company. And most importantly, it is a problem of error because noise is the sign that someone is wrong. If you believe there is a correct answer and two people disagree, at least one of them must be wrong. So what do we do about that? The good news is we can actually do something about noise once we are aware of it. Once we are aware of noise, once we become conscious of this problem in our judgments, there is things we can do. There is actually a lot of things we can do. First, we can measure noise. And there's a very counterintuitive feature of noise, which is that we don't need to know the right answer to measure noise. If you look at the judges, and all of them are giving you different judgments for the same defendant, you don't have to know what the correct sentence would be to know that you have a problem. If you are looking at these two targets, one of them is noisy, remember, and the other is noisy and biased. So the correct answer is the center of the target here. Suppose that you don't know where the center of the target is, and you're looking at the back of the target. You can immediately tell that there is noise in both these targets. You don't need to know where the center of the target is to measure the noise. This is what you do when you do an experiment we call a noise audit, which is what I was describing in the insurance company. Take a number of people and ask them to make the same judgment without consulting one another. Then measure the difference in their judgments. I bet you that wherever you do that, people who you think are in agreement will in fact find themselves in much greater disagreement than you think. This is what we saw in the insurance company. This is what the justice system shows. This is what the forensic scientist showed us with the fingerprints. This is what we see in child protection services. This is what we see in financial companies. Everywhere where we do a noise audit, we find that there is more noise than we think, and we don't need to know who is right to know that's a problem. So you can measure noise. But once you have measured noise and you don't know what the correct answer is, what do you do? Well, there is a way to eliminate noise. And you're not going to like it. And by the way, I don't like it either. That way to eliminate noise is simply to say, well, if wherever there is judgment, there is noise, let's eliminate judgment. Let's take the humans out of the equation. It's easy. Let's replace human judgment with a machine, with an algorithm, with machine learning, or simply with a good old-fashioned rule, simple rule that applies to everybody in the same way. No judgment, no discretion, no humanity anymore, problem solved. Now you can all see the problem with this approach. There are many problems with this approach. Of course, first of all, it's not even possible in many cases. How are you going to decide using a machine who gets 5 years in prison and who gets 20? This is a hard problem. But more importantly, and to a point that many of you have probably heard about, there is growing evidence that when we use algorithms, and specifically machine learning algorithms, to make those kinds of decisions, we actually have a problem called algorithmic bias or machine bias. In essence, because algorithms are trained on data that reflects past human decisions, those algorithms produce outcomes that reflect the same human biases. This particular study was done on algorithms that are used in the US to make or to facilitate judicial decisions. Turns out the algorithms seem to have, this is in dispute, but they seem to have biases that reflect the past racial biases of the US judicial system. There are lots of efforts to control that, and of course it will make progress, but while we are struggling with these bias problems, we don't have a lot of trust in machines to replace our human judgments, and we probably should not have too much trust in the short term. So there is going to be a lot of decisions for a long time that remain human decisions and that we need to make using our human judgment. The question then becomes, how can we improve that human judgment? How can we reduce the noise in that human judgment? And here, there is something that we can learn from the machines, which is not to use the machines, but which is to learn from them. The reason those machine learning algorithms are so powerful, because in many applications they are, is essentially because they are noise-free. They may be biased, as in the examples I was showing you, but given the same inputs, they will generally return exactly the same thing. They don't have good days and bad days. They are not more severe when their football team has lost. They are not more tired at the end of the day. And they are not different depending on whether you pick the algorithm in Louisiana or the algorithm in Texas. If you have the same algorithm, you get the same answer. Basically, algorithms are noise-free. What we should try to be is a little bit more noise-free too, is to basically be more disciplined, more systematic, more algorithm-like in our judgments. A little bit more like a machine without being a machine, of course, because we're humans. Basically, to be less noisy. How do we do that? The approach we propose to do that is something we call decision hygiene. And by decision hygiene, we mean that you're going to do for your decisions what you do when you wash your hands in order not to catch a disease. When you wash your hands, you're not thinking, this is the cold that I eliminated. Obviously, I didn't. And you're not saying, this is the flu, and you're not saying, this is COVID. You don't know what problem you're solving. But it's prevention. You know that you're solving problems even though you don't know exactly which ones. Decision hygiene works the same way. Because noise is an invisible enemy, because you never know exactly in what direction noise is going to pull you or push you, noise is not biased. Noise is not a predictable mistake. So you can't predict what mistake you're going to make, but you can take precautions to try to avoid making mistakes. You can wash your virtual hands in order to reduce the noise in your decisions. Basically, that means putting in place sound decision processes, solid decision processes that are robust to noise. Here are 4 simple and practical ways that you can do that. I'm going to try to illustrate 4 simple ways. The first idea is to aggregate independent inputs. The experiment that I'm showing you here is one that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's called the wisdom of crowds. Suppose that I ask you all to write down on a piece of paper. We're not going to do this because it takes time, but suppose that I asked you all to write down on a piece of paper how many jelly beans there are in this jar. Of course, you have no idea. So some of you are going to say 100, and some of you are going to say 1,000, because you have no idea. But if I then take the average, or even the median, of all your answers, it's going to be surprisingly, almost magically close to the correct answer. This is a phenomenon called the wisdom of crowds, which was discovered by Sir Francis Galton at the beginning of the 20th century. He was actually not using jelly beans, he was using farmers who had to guess the weight of an ox at a country fair. Basically, this is the fact that random errors, noise, cancel out when a lot of different people have their judgments aggregated. So, because you are all making a noisy error, you are all making a random error in judging how many jelly beans are in the jar, if I take the average of 100 answers in the room, I'm going to reduce the noise by a factor of 10, the square root of 100. This is beautiful. And this is what we intuitively think we do when we are in an organization and we have a difficult decision to make, and we say, let's bring in a few more people in the discussion so that we have more points of view, and we're going to take the points of view of multiple people. But, there is a big but, the way to do it matters a lot. When we get into a room and we talk, we are not creating the wisdom of crowds. We are actually creating more noise. We think we're doing something good, but we're actually making the problem worse. Why? Because in groups that talk, the wisdom of crowds does not exist. What you get is the equally well-known madness of crowds. Because people influence one another, because they become susceptible to groupthink, because they do not share the information that goes against the majority, because there is usually a boss who influences the others. As soon as we start talking, we destroy the value of aggregating opinions that should be independent. To take another analogy here, suppose that you're a detective and you have 5 suspects for the crime, and you have a number of different witnesses. Are you going to bring all the witnesses in the room and tell them, agree on who is the suspect who committed the crime and come see me when you have a decision? Of course not. What you're going to do is you're going to bring each witness into the room with the suspects, ask each witness to tell you which one it is, and if they all say it's number 3 without talking to each other, you have a pretty good idea that it's actually number 3. But if they are talking to one another, you've polluted their judgment. That seems obvious if I tell you you're a detective and you're talking about witnesses. Why isn't it obvious when we are in a meeting room and we think that the best way to make a decision together is to talk? So the practical thing to do here is don't talk. Don't talk. Or actually, don't talk just yet. Don't talk before you make sure that everyone who has a say in the decision has actually made their decision independently, or their judgment independently, has written it down before they know what the others think. And then, once everyone has written down their independently formed opinion, get into the room, have them share their opinions, and talk. The most frequent mistake that I see people make in organizations is that they go into meetings and they talk. It would be so easy, so simple to have a rule that you don't talk before you write. Just make sure that you write down what everyone thinks first before you actually start talking. Now you have the benefit, now you have the decision hygiene of having multiple independent opinions. And that's a great way to reduce noise. Just then take the collective opinion either by averaging or by discussing. Averaging is better than discussing. Take the average of those multiple independent opinions. You are much more likely to be closer to the truth. So aggregate opinions, but make sure they are independent. Second idea, don't use absolute judgments when you can use relative judgments. If I ask you to measure the length of the carrot here using the tape, 2 different people are going to give me 2 different measures because it's hard to measure a carrot. But if I ask you if the carrot is longer than the cucumber, we're not going to have a very long discussion. We're all going to be in agreement. Basically, we're all much better at making ordinal judgments than cardinal judgments, basically at comparing than at measuring. What does that mean? If I ask you, what does good mean? Or what does great mean on a scale of 0 to 10? This is an experiment that was done in the US where you ask people a number of words: great, incredible, fantastic, excellent, fine, pretty bad, and you ask them, what's that on a scale of 0 to 10? Now, it's interesting that some words are better than others, but what's really striking here is the dispersion, the noise, right? So perfect, many of you think it means 10, but some people think it means 7 out of 10. Now, how 7 out of 10 can be perfect is a mystery to me, personally, but some people think perfect is 7. Some people think great means 8, and some people think great means 4. So as soon as you're using words to describe something or someone, and even if you're using numbers, you may actually think that you agree but mean very different things. When you are in an organization and you are doing a performance review at the end of the year, and you have boxes to choose from that say outstanding, very good, good, not so great, bad, or whatever. Maybe one person says outstanding because they think outstanding means 7 out of 10, and another says outstanding because they think it means 10 out of 10. You can actually be in complete disagreement while using the same words. The scale that you're using adds to the noise. Now, if you take the same 2 people who disagree about outstanding and great, and you ask them, we have 5 people to evaluate, let's rank them from the best to the worst, you're going to find that they pretty much agree every time. It's a lot easier to compare than it is to measure. And that means that every time you can replace an absolute judgment with a comparison, you're actually making it a lot less noisy. There's a practical way to do that, which is to create comparison cases. And instead of saying, is this person good, to say, is this person better than that person that we have defined as the metric that represents good? Now you actually have a basis for comparison. By the way, I'm talking about people, but if you want to compare movies or restaurants, it works exactly the same way. Is this a great movie? We can disagree. Is it better than The Godfather? We're all going to agree. So basically, we can compare rather than measuring, we're all going to be better. Third way, and this is getting increasingly sophisticated, third way to reduce noise, structure your judgments. That basically means that when you have a complex judgment to make, you're going to break it down into smaller components that each of which is going to contribute to the overall judgment. We call these mediating assessments. Rather than going through the theory here, let me show you an example. When a baby is born, a doctor or a midwife needs to make an important judgment. Is this baby doing okay? Or does this baby need help? Now, this used to be a judgment that was made holistically by saying, yeah, little chap looks fine. Or, this one needs a little bit of help. Until this lady here, called Virginia Apgar, in the 1950s, I think, came up with a set of criteria, with a structure for this judgment. She basically said, look, when we're making this judgment, the 5 things that we all seem to be paying attention to are the color of the skin of the baby. If the baby is all blue, it's not a very good sign. The pulse of the baby, if we can feel a fast pulse, it's good news. The reflexes of the baby, the muscle tone of the baby, the activity, and the breathing. And when you name each of those things, you actually get an acronym that is the name of Virginia Apgar, which is good to be remembered, and you get something that is called the Apgar score, which is used universally to make essentially this judgment less noisy, less variable. When doctors look at a baby and say, is this baby okay, they disagree. When they ask, what's the appearance, what's the pulse, what's the grimace, what's the reflex, what's the activity, they actually agree a lot more, and they have a scoring system that actually structures that judgment. This applies to anything where you can actually decide what matters. As soon as you can decide what matters, you can break down your judgment into components. You can do this even to choose a role that you're going to play or not to play if you're an actor. This is Bryan Cranston of Breaking Bad fame, who tells you that when he needs to make a decision about what role he's going to play and what offer he's going to decline, he actually structures his judgment. He's got 4 criteria, one less than the Apgar score: the quality of the story, the quality of the writing, the character that he's going to play, and the director who makes the movie. Because, as he says, if he does not transfer his emotions into a kind of mathematical equation, he's going to be subjective and emotional, and he's going to make bad decisions. So Cranston has figured out a way to reduce the noise in his choice of which movies to play. If he can do it for movies, we should be able to do it for investments, but I'm going to spare you the details of that because I think now you get the idea. Fourth, and perhaps most important element, beware too much information. We have an idea, a sort of prejudice that information, as long as it's accurate, of course, helps. That knowing more about a problem can only be useful. In fact, that's wrong. The man you see here is called Brendan Mayfield. And the reason he became inadvertently famous is because after the Madrid bombings, which you remember where a couple of trains were bombed and a few hundred people were killed, he was arrested by the FBI in Oregon, where he lived, because his fingerprints had been found on a fragment of the bomb in Madrid. In fact, Brendan Mayfield had not planted the bomb, was not a terrorist, had never set foot in Madrid, and could prove that he hadn't. And by the way, the police in Spain never believed that he was a suspect and didn't think that his fingerprints matched the ones that the FBI had found. So why did the FBI believe that a man who the Spanish police did not think had his fingerprints on the bomb was a perfect match? It so happened that Brendan Mayfield was a lawyer who had himself converted to Islam and who was defending suspects of Islamic terrorism. Basically, he fit the profile. And because the FBI experts knew that, their judgment about the fingerprints which we think is purely objective and based on the fingerprints, which they thought was purely objective and based on the fingerprints, was actually influenced by what they knew. It was true, by the way, that he was a lawyer defending Islamic terrorists, but knowing that literally changes what you see in the fingerprints. So more information is not always good. If there is information that you would not want to take into account, you should try to not be exposed to it. I'll give you a very simple example that I've been working in business for a long time. I could never quite figure out. Why does a resume or a CV that you submit for a job need to include your hobbies? Either you want to take into account the hobbies of the people you are hiring, and you should say, we're hiring only golfers. That's okay. Or you don't want to take it into account, and then you should not ask for it, because it can only bias you. If someone says their hobby is hunting and you hate hunting, that's going to bias you unfavorably. If someone says their hobby is tennis and they play in the same club that you do, it's going to bias you favorably. Either way, you're going to make a decision that, on principle, you would want to say you should not make, because you would not want to use that information, but you have created a system in which you are exposed to information you should not know. So make sure you are not exposed to information you don't want to see and you don't want to play into your judgment. That's a good safeguard against noise. That's the way to keep your intuition in check. What we do when we have too much information is that we build an early intuition. We basically trust our intuition too much. We don't rely just on the facts. We form a holistic judgment that blinds us to the facts that contradict what we see. We don't want to know too much. We want to keep our intuition for the end. I've given you 4 ideas. There are many more, by the way, but if you keep in mind aggregation of independent judgments, relative rather than absolute judgments, keeping intuition for the end, and structuring your judgments, you're in pretty good shape to reduce noise in your judgments and to practice decision hygiene. To sum up, before I try to answer your, I hope, numerous questions, 3 ideas that we have covered. First, there is bias in many places. There is also noise everywhere. We should care about bias, and in most places we do. We should also care about noise, and in most places we don't. We should treat noise as a problem, as a costly problem, as a problem that needs to be dealt with. And the good news is that noise, just like bias, albeit with different techniques, can be measured, can be reduced, and can be managed to make better judgments and better decisions. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to discussing this with you and to hearing your questions. I just need to put on the little thing to get the translation. Thank you very much.
Molte grazie.
Thank you very much. You can ask your questions in Italian, please, not in English, because this would increase the noise. It would increase the... There is translation here, so I can break the ice. Can I have the privilege to ask a first question? Well, I got many questions, but the first that comes to my mind is the following. I got the impression that there is a close link also with the quality of the data available. For instance, in medicine, in evidence-based medicine, the lowest level evidence is the expert opinion. This is level 4 in the scale of evidence, whereas the soundest evidence is the evidence that comes from controlled trials and so on and so forth. The table that you showed on medical decision, you see a gradient. For instance, a radiologist's evaluation. Radiology is a typical area where the introduction of machine learning algorithms combined with human evaluation reduces the noise. At the opposite extreme, you put psychiatrists, where the data available are not based on biological markers, but on the expert opinion. So the opinion that depends on the clinical experience of the examiner. So I got the impression there is this type of trade-off. And algorithms are certainly subject to bias, but in this specific case, increasing the amount of data would improve the performance of the machine learning algorithm.
Absolutely. So, two thoughts on this. Sorry, I need to take this off. First of all, we're talking about different types of judgments and different types of science, as you point out. And wherever we have essentially more automated processes, noise goes away. So where we do, and there are many places where we do have machines that make good judgments and that are not biased, it's perfect, it's great. And by the way, we don't talk about those anymore, right? Nobody complains that you have blood tests that give you a diagnosis of whether you have diabetes, rather than having a doctor who says, oh, you look like you have diabetes. So some of these things become very simple. Where noise comes in is not at the level of the science in general, but at the level of each case. So even for a decision, leaving aside the decisions that are completely automated, any judgment, any medical judgment, but any judgment of any kind, is a case-by-case judgment. And on a case-by-case basis, even in domains where we think we have pretty much settled science, we still find more noise than we think. Now, that doesn't mean there's a lot of noise everywhere. Of course, there is more in psychiatry than in radiology. But what is surprising is that we have more than we believe. When we believe, for instance, fingerprints to be perfect, and we tell jurors and judges that fingerprints are incontrovertible evidence, you actually find that in 10% of cases, they can disagree with themselves. I'm not even talking about different fingerprint experts disagreeing. I'm talking about people disagreeing with themselves. It's of course much worse when they disagree with each other. So science progresses, of course, and levels of evidence get better and better with time. But wherever we still have judgment, we still have variability within cases, between different professionals. That's the molto chiaro.
That was very clear. Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? Good evening, and thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you very much for your books that I'm reading. I'm a judge myself, so I listened very carefully to what you said. You rightly made reference to the United States in your examples. Before asking your question, I would like to point out the following. Your study, noise, is very much debated by judges and lawyers, and it is having an impact on the law in our country. But in the United States, the system had to be efficient and able to act quickly. I'm a judge here in Italy, but I read an article published in the American press, and apparently, because of the huge amount of cases to be dealt with by the judges in the States, is 1.5 minutes, whereas in Italy, the average is 3 years. So I'm talking about, of course, a civil law. In the States, most of the judges in trials are not even asked to provide arguments or to justify their decisions. And their judgment is passed at a different stage than when the crime is evaluated and decided upon. So this has an impact, of course, on the judge, because if the judge doesn't have to provide the reasons of why the judgment has been passed, then it becomes more difficult, to then justify one's judgment. So we may, by saying this, convey a wrong idea about judges. Judges are not priests. They stick to the rules of the legal system. If the legal system doesn't ask to provide the reasons, well, there is a greater risk to, create more noise. Whereas in Europe, the situation is completely different. All the suggestions you gave are already been incorporated in the legal system. And there is an essay of the 40s published here in Italy that said that the sense of the trial is reducing the rate of error of the judges. So we descend from Hume's. We know that ideas or the impressions are the result of the feeling and thinking at the same time. So we have a completely different culture here in Europe. Anyway, my question is the following. In Italy, we talk so much the extra-contractual responsibility, so the so-called tort law. And we witnessed a rather worrying issue. For instance, in some areas of Italy, because the death of a son was compensated with 100,000 euros. In other parts of Italy, with 1 million euro. Probably the judge is influenced by the cost of living, or a judge who has lost a son may compensate for the grievance with a higher amount. So now tables have been introduced that set the range of the compensation in case of death. This has increased the certainty and the predictability of decisions, a better way to manage the insurance risk. And even a greater number of conciliations. But with time, and we have been observing this recently, with time we have observed a kind of flattening of the judgment of the judges when it comes to compensation. So there is the risk that in order to reduce noise, which is fair enough, may lead to a reduction of the responsibility of the decision that the judge must take upon himself or herself. So, I mean, a judge is always faced with different cases, with different stories. Ever since I've become a judge, I've never seen a case similar to the others, because the life of a person is never like the life of another person. So my question is the following. Trying to reduce noise, wouldn't this imply the risk of reducing or weakening the sense of responsibility? Because, again, a judge must make decisions by, again, providing also the arguments and the reasons why the decision has been made.
Thank you very much for your question. So, first of all, I'm very happy to hear that judges in Europe and in Italy are concerned about this, because in the US we've been, let's say, surprised by the reaction of judges. We got a lot of calls from doctors saying, oh, we want to measure noise in medicine, and from professors saying, oh, we want to measure the noise in admissions decisions in universities, and from all kinds of professionals in all fields, and of course from insurance companies and financial companies. And we were surprised not to get calls from judges until one day Danny Kahneman got a call from the Association of Judges in California, who said, we've read your book and we really would like you to come and talk about noise in medicine. So we could sense some defensiveness in the judicial profession about this. And the defensiveness takes often the form of the argument that you were making, which is that two cases are never identical, and that therefore it takes the wisdom of a judge to determine which case, to take into account the specifics of each case. And this is an absolutely valid point, of course, right? All the studies that we're talking about are not studies that compare similar cases. They are studies that ask different judges to judge identical cases, which is why they are simulations. You can't do this in real life, right? In real life, you only have one judge. The point is, if you had another one, the answer would be very different. Now, the remedy to that the US implemented for a while, and then gave up for reasons that are purely technical and have nothing to do with what we're discussing here? The answer to that is exactly what you are describing, which is to have rules that essentially limit the arbitrariness of those judgments, like the tables that you had for the cost of a life, which applies in many different fields. You apply it for the cost of a life, but you can apply it for the extenuating circumstances for a crime, and so on and so forth. The US did this for a while. They had guidelines for criminal sentencing that were determined by a special commission, many of the members of which ended up on the Supreme Court, so it was done quite seriously. Federal sentencing guidelines were put in place, and the aim was basically to do what you described, which is to say, let's make sure that this is not too random because of the susceptibility of one individual here and one individual there. Let's make sure that people actually have to provide an explanation, and let's list what are the acceptable explanations. Given the table, given the guidelines, it basically gives you a range, so you still have some discretion within that range. And by the way, if you want to go out of the range, you can. You are a sovereign judge, and you have the freedom to do that. You only have to justify it, and to be able to explain it, and to be prepared to justify it to an appeals court. It worked in terms of reducing the noise, in terms of reducing the random variability, in terms of reducing the effect of individual biases. It worked superbly well. Until one day, for reasons entirely unrelated to what we're talking about here, and that are purely technical, the Supreme Court said, in fact, those guidelines cannot be mandatory, they can only be advisory, and then the noise returned, which shows that it's human nature, and probably judicial nature specifically, but probably human nature in general, to want to exercise your judgment when the system lets you exercise it. If you are told you can do whatever you want, you will. If you are told you can do whatever you want, provided that you explain it, and you made this point very clearly, you will be a little bit more disciplined. If you are told you have to evaluate the following criteria, we have structured the decision for you. You should take into account whether it's a recidivist, and whether there was violence, and whether there were extenuating circumstances, and you list the things that are part of the structure of the decision, you will have less variability. Now, I think that's better. I observe that a lot of judges disagree and prefer to have it their way. And I'm not a judge, so I have to respect that.
Thank you. Altre domande? C'è una domanda là.
Are there other questions? There is one down there. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you very much for your presentation, which was very interesting. My question is the following. Aren't there cases when there is just one objective answer to a problem? So where there is a range of correct answers, an example could be I don't know, the limit of speed in the motorway, because you can't evidence that the best limit is 130 or 121 or 129. So what I know is that the range, the right range could be between 110 and 150 kilometers an hour. So even if there is noise in decisions, not necessarily these decisions are wrong. It is not that one is right, the others are all wrong. There can be variability, which is acceptable. All answers could be right. I'm thinking of speculative fields such as the insurance field, or fields where our knowledge is very limited, like the field of medicine, because in many cases in medicine we do not know what the right answer is, so there is a variability range which one must expect.
So it's an interesting question to, I want to double click on what you said, and to try to elaborate on what it means to have for a question to have a correct answer. It's getting a bit philosophical, but it's actually important. When you say there is a range of possible answers, I agree with that, right? But within that range, are some answers better than others? And if not, how are you going to decide where the range stops? So I'll give you an example. You took the example of the speed limit. I'm not actually sure it's a great example because we wouldn't want the speed limit to be different for every person, right? But let's take the example of the insurance price, since you picked that one also. Sure, you will never actually know what the correct price is for an insurance policy. By the way, that's why you have experts, right? It's because there is uncertainty. If you could determine with precision what the correct price is, it wouldn't be a matter of judgment anymore. When we say something is a matter of judgment, it basically means what you just said, which is that there is a range of answers that we expect, right? But does that mean that all these answers are equally acceptable? For the insurance company, it is clear analytically that there is an optimal price, which is the highest price that the market will support, so that you will not lose the business, but which is not so low that you will lose business by insuring the customer. So there is a perfect price. You will never know it. It is not knowable, but it exists. And in fact, the people who are making that judgment behave as if it exists. They are experts and they claim to be making the best possible judgment. If they realize that their next door neighbor is making a completely different judgment from them, they look at him in surprise and they say, "You must be crazy. Have you had too long and leisurely and drunken a lunch? It's not possible that you think so differently from me." When two HR executives look at the profile of Michael Gambardi, and of course there is a range of possible answers. We don't know that the probability that Michael will be successful is 37.2%. That's ridiculous. But if one of us thinks it's 10% and another one thinks it's 90%, clearly we have a problem. We shouldn't be HR executives in the same company. So when you say there is a range of possible answers, the way I say it, and I think we're saying the same thing, is there is a range of tolerable disagreement around the correct answer that we're all looking for. We all behave as if there is a correct answer, which we cannot know. We find it completely normal, because this is, after all, a matter of judgment, that we're going to have a bounded disagreement around that answer. The 10% that we all answered about the insurance company, yeah, 10% would be okay. If you say 95 and I say 105, it's within reasonable limits. But the reason we can say that is because we share the view that there is a true correct answer that we are all trying to get close to. Of course, we cannot know it, but we're still trying to get close to it. So I think wherever we're making a judgment, I'm going to phrase it differently to try to make this more visual. We are behaving in exactly the same way as someone who is making a measurement. If you are measuring the length of a piece of rope, you are going to measure it with a tape and you're going to come up with a number. Someone is going to come up with a slightly different number. If you step on your bathroom scale, you're going to read the number, it's going to give you your weight, but maybe if you step on it a few minutes later, it's going to give you a slightly different weight. These disagreements remain acceptable, but we all believe that there is a true weight and there is a true length. Just because we get two different measurements using a different measurement instrument or measuring at a different time does not mean that we don't believe there is a true length and a true weight. Likewise, when we're making a judgment, we're using our mind as the measuring instrument. And if two minds are giving you two different measures, or if your own mind is giving you two different measures at different times, that doesn't mean that there is no truth. You still believe there is a truth. You still believe you're trying to get close to it. That truth cannot be known with precision, but the reason we work so hard at making judgments is because we believe it exists. If we didn't, we would just pick a random number. So bounded disagreement is the term that I use for what you call a range of possible answers. It's a bounded disagreement around what we believe to be the correct answer, or around the correct answer that we can't know but that we believe exists, if you see what I mean.
Thank you. Altre domande?
Any more questions?
Ne faccio una ancora.
Well, I'll be asking the last question then. I was wondering about the relationship between bias and noise, thinking of the judges and the asylum seekers. So, If you select two groups of judges whom a political inclination you are aware of, for instance, conservative or liberal, right-wing or left-wing, I can expect bias reducing noise there because I would expect more consistency in the judgment. Is that correct?
One of the sources of, I mean, at least it would reuse one of the sources of noise, which is what I've called level noise, which is the difference in the average level of those judges. So that would take away one of the sources of noise. Or to take another example, if I'm a professor and I'm grading students, and you're a professor and you're grading students, and you're a nice guy and I'm an asshole. And the students know that, and they prefer to have you rather than have me, but bad luck, some of them have to have me. On average, I'm going tougher grades, and you're giving higher grades. We could say, well, we don't want any of that nonsense. Everybody needs to have an average of 10 out of 20 or 50 out of 100. That's a rule of the school, and that way we make the level noise go away. So your bias to be lenient and my bias to be severe have been ironed out of the process. That essentially solves the level noise problem. But when we think we've solved that problem, we haven't solved the problem of occasion noise, which is that at the end of the day, I'm more severe than at the beginning. After I've seen 3 very good essays, I'm tougher with the 4th one. And of course, we haven't solved the problem that what you regard as a great essay may be one that I find mediocre and vice versa. Or in other words, that your ranking of the essays is not going to be the same as mine. That's our pattern noise. So yes, different individual biases produce level noise in a system. That's easy to take care of if you want to and if you can. It's easier for the professors than for the judges. But that doesn't take into account the other 2 sources of noise, which are unfortunately much larger.
Gli studenti conoscono in realtà questi principi.
Actually, students are fully aware of these mechanisms. Even the fact that you may be more severe before lunch, these are all things that students are fully aware of.
Altre domande? Mi dicono che
I've been told this is it. Thank you very much.